Okay, this video is about gesture drawing and some of the things that I think about as I'm laying the figure down on the page in the initial stages. Different types of line are going to be important in gesturing. So let's talk about three of those right now. One is this type of curve where you have a point A and a point B and just a single trip between them. I'm going to call that a C curve, and those can be gentle or they can be extreme. But all of those are C curves. You just have one point and another point and the curve between. Then we have S curves. And as the name implies, there's a point A and a point B, but there's this change in direction on the way from point A to point B. And again, those can be extreme or they can be very gentle. You can see why we call it a C curve and an S curve. Those two curves are going to really be helpful in gesturing. They're going to be really helpful when drawing the figure generally because they add life and movement and action to things. The other thing to discuss is just straight lines. If you use a straight line, notice how tight that feels versus this. Right? This feels like it's under tension. We almost think of a rope. If this is a rope, it's relaxed. If this is a rope, it's getting pulled tight. It's under tension. We will read that the same way in a drawing. So anytime you have tension or weight being put on something, you look for these moments of tension. That's a good place to have a straight line in a gesture. You may flesh that out with anatomy later. It might turn into something. So if it's a straight leg like this, it's going to feel like it's got tension, weight being put on it. Any line that is straight is going to introduce tension. Any relationship, like especially limbs, arms or legs that are straight are going to introduce tension as well. If you're using this type of line, that line says I'm scared. I don't quite know what I'm up to. So I'm just going to kind of ease my way around that corner. We will read that always as uncertainty. Don't let that creep into your drawing. These are sketchy lines, but they're kind of exploratory and they feel confident. They feel like you're onto something. These feel like I'm just gonna hope, right? I'm just gonna hope around that corner. It's called the hairy line. I call it a hairy line. That line is nice if you're trying to make something look like it has hair on it in a silhouette. It's a very specific time you might use that line. I'll be on the lookout for that in gestures. I don't want to see it. I'd much rather see these big sweeping lines, even if they're sketchy. I mean, here I've got like 5 or 6 different lines, but they're sketchy and they all follow kind of this idea. I didn't build this curve out of like that. This is a totally different situation. We don't want that in our gestures. We want this. Now, there are 2 types of poses that I think about whenever I'm drawing the figure. The first is an open pose, and here's an example of that. And the second is a closed pose. And here's an example of that. So in an open pose, the thing that I'm looking for in an open pose is the line of action. What it is, it's just the general line that you can maybe run through that whole pose. So for this image, for instance, I would consider this an open pose. And if I look at the overall pose, there's this kind of line running through the body down that leg. Right? Anything else kind of serves that overall arc. So that's what I'm looking for in an open pose. Just what is the line or the major idea behind that pose? And then I can build the gesture on top of that central idea. That's going to help me keep that relationship across the body. I notice that there's an arc that runs through the whole thing. Right here I have this sort of a map of what the figure feels like, and I've kind of cropped it on the page. But I get a sense of the arm, I get a sense of the leg, I get this relationship arc through the figure. That helps me start making choices about this figure within the first 15 seconds, the first 30 seconds of drawing it. It's not perfect, and there are some issues I can already see with it, like I've got it too vertical here. Even though I started with that arc, I still kind of straightened the figure up, and as I'm looking, I actually think that he's leaned back just a little bit more. But that's an open pose. I started with that big curve. And I would consider this pose a closed pose. And by that, I mean the figure's kind of tucked in on itself. It's not stretched out like the other one. And a closed pose is nice. I'm thinking about the same kind of big abstract things, but in a closed pose, I might make a shape first instead. So I notice here's a curve. I'm always on the lookout for curves. That's what I would call the envelope of the pose. It's the big basic shape that contains that figure. I can use this as my beginning map on what to do with the gesture. So I noticed right about to here, there's kind of a straight, there's some tension in that arm. So I'm gonna put some straight lines there because that arm feels straight, like there's weight on it. This is kind of what that pose feels like to me. This is just a real loose sense of the pose. Again, nothing's really super accurate yet. Okay, so this I would consider a closed pose, and I'm thinking of that envelope to start things with. It's not a hard and fast thing. It's not something that I'm stuck on, right? Like if I decide that this leg isn't doing quite what it should, fixing it is just a matter of right, now this is the leg. If I feel like this arm was going too straight, I can point it backwards a little bit. And that's all a gesture is. At the end of the day, there's no hard and fast rules about what a gesture has to be. There are just some overarching ideas behind a gesture. One is that it happens quickly. Two is that it happens loosely. You can see a lot of my movements were from the shoulder. I'm holding the pencil like this. I'm working from my shoulder. You don't see a lot of this in a gesture. In fact, you shouldn't see any of that. You want to work from the shoulder, getting these big, broad ideas down. It's a way of mapping out what's going to happen in the pose before you get down to the details. You're just capturing the overall impression before you dig into those details. And it will save you a lot of heartache later. Nothing is worse than getting 2 hours through a drawing and realizing that something's not quite right and it's something you could have resolved in the gesture, or it's just too stiff. It doesn't feel like it's convincing to look at. It feels awkward, and it's because something got missed in a gesture or you didn't gesture at all. So that's an overview of gesture and some things to look for. Remember open pose, remember closed pose, remember to draw from your shoulder. You can see my whole arm is moving here. There's a bit of elbow involved, a lot of shoulder involved.